Hi there. In our devotion today, I wanted to take you to Romans chapter 8. I want to read few verses that talks about the importance of allowing the Spirit of God to continue to have a domination in our lives. Why? Because unless we allow the Spirit of God to dominate our mind, our emotions, our will, and our desires, then it will be very hard to have the day of resurrection in our life. Because our resurrection depends on the Spirit of God. Why? Because Paul says that it was Christ, when he died, it was the Spirit of God who raised him from the dead. Let me read. It says in verse 10, "But if Christ is in you, your body is dead because of sin, yet your spirit is alive because of righteousness." So, what Christ did brought us life. And then he says in verse 11, "And if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who lives in you." So Christ brought salvation and he brought life to us. And now the Spirit of God is going to be in charge of our life. So when we die, and it is the same Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead, if He lives in us, then He is going to raise us, you know, from the dead. And He is going to raise our mortal bodies to life. So there is life in the Spirit. That is why the Spirit of God is called life-giving Spirit. That is the same Spirit of God that was upon Jesus. When he was anointed of the Spirit of God, it was the same Spirit of God who was in him. And it was the Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead. He gave his body life again. Jesus had a glorified body in his resurrection. That is the same way it's going to be for us. If the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in us, then we have that hope of resurrection one day, that the Spirit of God is going to raise us up also. He will give us the immortal spiritual body that we can live with the Lord forever. That is the hope of Christianity. Christianity is not a dead religion. Christianity is a relationship, that we need to have a relationship with Christ so that we can be saved and brought into righteousness, right relationship with God. And then Spirit of God helps us day after day in our weaknesses so that we will continue to obey God, so that we can have that hope of being raised from the dead one day. And Christ is coming very soon. And before his coming, it is the duty of every believer to continue to obey the Spirit of God and his voice in our day-to-day life. Because the Spirit of God is given to us to be our director, to be our leader, to be our guide and comfort. And so this morning, I want to encourage you with the Word of God that reveals to us there is life in Jesus, and He can give life to us. It is because of the Spirit of God that was in Him. And if the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, you will have hope, because one day that same Spirit of God who lives in us will raise us up also. So verse 12, Paul says, "Therefore, brothers, we have an obligation, but it is not to the sinful nature to live according to it. For if you live according to the sinful nature, you will die." So there's a danger after salvation. If we continue to live a life that is not pleasing to God, live a life of sin that is pleasing to our flesh, our sinful nature, then there is only death. Death is the separation from God. And so, if you want to live a life eternally with God, then you need to have a life of obedience to the Spirit of God in your day to day life. And so, Paul says, "For if you live according to the sinful nature, you will die. But if By the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of your body, you will live. So there's a request, it's a call from God to us saying that we can be in danger if we disobey the Spirit of God in our day-to-day life. Because the Spirit of God gives us life and hope. In verse 14 it says, because those who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. So you will be qualified as the sons of God if you allow the Spirit of God to continue to live in you and dominate your life. Let the Spirit of God have an upper hand in your life. Put your flesh under control. Let the Spirit of God dominate you, because there is hope in that kind of life. God bless you today as you continue to serve Him.